To help the president in winnowing down his list of possible Supreme Court nominees, the president, of course, relied on his White House team, but he also included some influential conservative legal experts from outside the government. One of those experts was John Malcolm, Heritage Foundation Vice President for the Institute for Constitutional Government, and he's also a former Deputy Assistant Attorney General. Welcome. Good to have you here, John.
It's great to be with you.
So give us as much insight as you can into this process, because you have been an outside advisor and have been closely involved.
Well, look, I prepared a list before the president's list about a month after Justice Scalia died of 8 people whom I thought would make superb Supreme Court justices, and Brett Kavanaugh was on that list. I have some contacts in the White House counsel's office, but I wasn't there day to day. But Don McGahn, knows the conservative legal movement. He's been very quietly effective, focused on judges. He brought in excellent advisors like Leonard Leo, the executive vice president of the Federalist Society, and he narrowed that field down to 4 outstandingly qualified men and women, and in my opinion, went with the best one.
When you say outstandingly qualified, how much of that is the legal pedigree? Because there is clearly a legal pedigree here. How much of it is an established track record of, as you would say, conservative judicial decision making? Well,
Judge Barrett, Amy Coney Barrett, was on that list. She's only been a judge for about 8 months, but she was a distinguished academic who had a long history of very scholarly publications on issues that conservatives care about in terms of a pedigree. Tom Hardiman, no slouch, but went to Georgetown Law School, didn't go to one of the Ivy League. Some people were questioning his pedigree. I think the president focused on the qualifications of all of these people and looked at their body of work, and Brett Kavanaugh certainly does have that pedigree and a very distinguished record.
And when you refer to the body of work, because it's a large one, President Trump last night referred to 300 decisions. How important was the administrative component? I mean, Greg just talked about that, and we do have, for example, that important CFPB decision in which he really struck down a Congress saying the president can't replace the head of the CFPB. How important was it, his position on really separation of powers?
Yeah, I think very important. I mean, the White House counsel, Don McGahn, has stressed that in several speeches that he has given. He is skeptical of so-called Chevron deference. That's the deference that courts give to executive branch agencies in interpreting arguably ambiguous laws. He believes in a strict separation of powers and thinks that administrative deference blurs the line between congressional power and executive branch power. And Judge Kavanaugh has spoken eloquently on those topics, not only his opinions, but also at speeches, including a prominent speech he gave at the Heritage Foundation last year.
It's impossible to know what any individual will do once they're on the Supreme Court. They're life tenured and they decide for themselves. At the same time, as you look forward, how far could this go? Because it's not just the Chevron doctrine. It's not just deferring to the interpretation of the law. It's also the question of how subject to presidential order the independent agencies should be. I mean, that was the CFPB problem.
Oh, that's right.
Could it extend as well to things like the SEC, to the FTC, to NLRB, to say really they should be more like the Department of Treasury or the Justice Department?
Well, no one's called at the moment for looking into independent agencies, although Brett Kavanaugh, in one of his opinions, made a reference to a famous Supreme Court decision that dealt with independent agencies and said perhaps it's time to revisit that. It was the structure of the CFPB, the fact that there was a single director who was essentially accountable to nobody and could only be removed for cause, that struck Brett Kavanaugh as violating separation of powers principles. I think he was right about that, and we will see the voice that he brings to the Supreme Court once he's confirmed.
So if you were to guess, and it is a guess, we recognize that, it would be more likely to see, if you're a businessman, a difference in just really being receptive to challenges to regulations and paring back of regulations, or really fundamental changes?
Well, look, I think that a conservative justice will be a textualist and will look to apply the law, whether it's statutory or the Constitution, as those laws are written, without importing their own personal or political values into the law. And I think that provides certainty, which should be of importance to the business community. There will, of course, be some important rulings involving things like intellectual property, arbitration, where conservative justices have an approach, but a lot of it has to do with just certainty in terms of applying the law as written.
There'll be a lot of rhetoric in the Senate. Do you think there's a serious chance that this could not be, he could not be confirmed?
Well, the margins, as you pointed out, are very slim. With John McCain not in Washington, they're effectively 50-49. The Democrats are throwing a lot of mud on the wall to see what sticks. I think it's going to be very hard getting any of that to stick to Brett Kavanaugh.
How much of this do you see as part of a longer process that the conservative legal establishment has really undertaken to change the direction of the court?
Look, I think the president has focused like a laser with the able assistance of his White House counsel on changing the direction of the courts. I think that Barack Obama tried to do the same during his 8 years in office. There are only 9 Supreme Court justices. They frequently sit for decades after the president who appointed them leaves office, and so it's a very, very important confirmation fight.